thank you for asking me, and applaud what you're doing here. I think it's very important. I think the importance of this came through to me from several of the leading players in the room. I think I met Redhotcurry a couple of years ago when I first came into this job at a meeting in Leicester. He'd assembled a group of Leicester business people, and mostly from the Asian community, and their frustration that they were not being heard. I mean, this was in the heart of the financial crisis, difficulties of getting credit, and these were the people who were actually driving the regional economy, and Leicester in particular, and a sense that there was no body that actually articulated their concerns, but also their positive thinking, and I think in many ways this is a fulfilment of that. I'd like to thank Baroness Pressure as well, who I know as Usha from, we met in Glasgow 40 years ago, I think. We realised there was a connection through her family and my late wife's family through the East African Asian diaspora, and we've kept in touch ever since, and she now does great work in the House of Lords for the UK, but also particularly for the Asian community here. And there are some people around this room who exemplify much of what the Asian community does in Britain. At the front door I met Nat Puri, who I opened a centre in Nottingham last week, which he was involved in, the driving force behind manufacturing in another East Midlands city. And I guess that story could be duplicated many times with people in this room. There aren't too many statistics to go on, but as far as I can establish, if you put aside self-employment, which is massive, there are probably something in the order of 50,000 Asian businesses in the UK, Asian British businesses in the UK. So it's a very significant part of our economy. As Baroness Pressure said, it is in many ways, very London-centric. I think roughly half are centred in London, and we're talking about a massive economy here. 60 billion turnover from Asian British businesses in London, but also very important in many provincial areas, East and West Midlands, Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Scotland. I mean, those of you who have any connection with Scotland will know that the voice of British business in Scotland, the president of the Confederation of British Industries, is from the Pakistani business community in Glasgow. And that influence is very much with us. And the traditional, the stereotype of the Asian business is changing rapidly, and I came from East Africa for some years, and the traditional Duka Walla who runs a shop, I mean that stereotype is of course it's still there in many cases. I think something around 30% of Asian British businesses are in the retail sector, but it is rapidly diversifying, not just in traditional manufacturing, but large numbers now of significant successful companies in areas like telecommunications and pharmaceuticals and advanced engineering. And these are, it is now a very diverse and successful business community. And of course the traditional business model, which is the family-owned business, I think in the past I've met Asian entrepreneurs who wanted to get beyond that to do the PLC thing. But I think one of the things we're beginning to realise as a result of this crisis, that the family business model actually has a lot to commend it. So it's actually it's more difficult to raise capital, but it does have a long-term perspective, which in many British companies we've often lost. People are thinking very short-term, whereas the Tartars of this world think the generation ahead, and that is a great asset in terms of the business environment that I'm ultimately responsible for in government. So that's why I think a group of this kind that brings the various Asian business groups together and speaks for them is enormously useful and valuable, and something I want to work with and support. But in terms of what government is doing, which is relevant, I think there are a whole series of areas where policy is developing in good ways. I think first of all we do recognise the difficulties being experienced as a result of the collapse of the banking system and the availability of business credit. The fact that Santander are one of your sponsors, I think, signals a recognition that small business funding is a problem and needs support. We've now got this funding for lending scheme going, which is beginning to make an impact in freeing up capital, more for mortgage lending than business, but I think that will come, is happening. I'm currently in the business of establishing a British business bank through government funding that will hopefully provide wholesale finance to lubricate this segment of the market which has not worked well in the last few years. And we're beginning to see more and more kind of non-traditional type of lending, both through new banks coming on the scene, through equity, which has perhaps been underrepresented in business funding in the UK, things like crowdfunding, which are beginning to happen on a bigger scale, and which entrepreneurs are beginning to tap into. So I think there's a lot happening in terms of access to finance, but I do know from regular contact there are a lot of Asian businesses still struggling to raise basic working capital from the banking system. I think secondly, tax. We are trying to create an attractive environment for entrepreneurs. Capital gains tax, entrepreneurs relief, the SCIS scheme, trying to get some relief on business rates, which I know a lot of people operating out of town centres find particularly onerous. The relief scheme, I know a lot of companies feel it's not enough, and it is important to remember we are running this horrendous budget balance issue that we're trying to rectify over time, and it gives limited scope for tax cutting, but we are trying to focus it where it really matters for business growth. Exports, I spend a good deal of my time, as does the Prime Minister, trying to get out into the wider world, promoting British trade with particularly the big emerging markets, of which the Indian subcontinent is one big success story in many areas. We've neglected it, frankly, over the years, but I think in this government we're really trying to apply ourselves to that. Not just promoting trade, but capital flows in both directions. One of the good things about Britain is, compared with many other Western countries, we have a very open, welcoming approach to inward investment. We're not turned off by overseas nationality. The fact that our biggest manufacturing company in Britain is now Indian-owned is not an issue. Probably it's an asset rather than a problem. And that's how we look at things. So we do want to promote exports, particularly to the big emerging markets, and we do want to promote inward investment, and we know that the diaspora community has got quite an important part in all of that. And then I think finally, we do recognise that if business is to function properly, we've got to have a minimum of red tape. My department's doing a lot to clear away some of the clutter and obstacles. I think we inherited something over 22,000 government regulations, which we're now trying to get rid of where they're not justified and appropriate. We do have probably the most flexible labour markets in the Western world, apart from the United States, and that's reflected in the fact that even in very difficult times, we've seen well over 1 million private sector jobs created in the last couple of years. And I think what we're also seeing, again in difficult times emerging from this very serious crisis, a lot of people trying their hand at business. I think the rate of startups, entrepreneurial activity was at a record level last year, and a lot of Asian families are involved in that process, and that's the way growth is going to come. But I just finally just repeat what I said, a welcome for this organisation, trying hopefully to bring together what has often in the past been a slightly fragmented voice from the Asian business community. It's important that you're heard. It's very important in terms of its contribution to Britain, and I very much welcome this morning. Thank you.